Hi, this is Amy. This is a special video for our locals community. Minnesota has become the epicenter of a staggering fraud scandal that has bilked taxpayers out of hundreds of millions of dollars, with full scope still emerging. The scheme, which primarily exploited the state's federally funded child nutrition programs, has revealed a disturbing level of complicity, negligence, and potential corruption within the state's highest political offices. As federal investigators, led by the Trump administration, crack down, Minnesota's Democratic establishment is mounting a fierce campaign of distraction, using protests against Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, as a smokescreen to obscure their own involvement. One could describe the fraud in Minnesota was like a criminal mastermind's playground. At the heart of the scandal is the Feeding Our Future nonprofit, which acted as a central hub for a massive criminal enterprise. The group sponsored numerous sites across the state that claimed to be providing meals to underprivileged children. In reality, these were often shell operations. The fraudsters submitted claims for millions of meals that were never served, using the money to fund lavish lifestyles, luxury cars, real estate, and international travel instead of food. The scale is breathtaking. Over $250 million in federal funds was stolen, making it one of the largest fraud cases in U.S. history. The scheme was brazenly simple yet effective. The perpetrators inflated the number of children they were serving, forged documents, and created fake invoices. They exploited a system designed to be flexible and quick during the COVID-19 pandemic, when federal oversight was temporarily relaxed to get food to families in need. This flexibility became a vulnerability that criminals ruthlessly exploited. So, who was responsible? While the criminals who directly ran the scheme are now facing justice, the critical question is how they were able to operate for so long and on such a massive scale without being stopped. This is where the responsibility of state officials comes into sharp focus. The Minnesota Department of Education, MDE. This agency was the primary state-level overseer of the federal child nutrition programs. For years, whistleblowers and concerned citizens raised red flags about the implausible numbers being reported by Feeding Our Future and its affiliates. Yet MDE officials, under the watch of successive administrations, failed to act decisively. They continued to approve payments despite glaring inconsistencies, effectively greenlighting the theft. The agency's internal audits were either non-existent or ignored, and its staff appeared either willfully ignorant or dangerously incompetent. Governor Tim Walz, as the state's chief executive, Governor Walz bears ultimate responsibility for the performance of his administration. The fraud flourished on his watch. While he now expresses shock and vows reform, his administration's failure to provide basic oversight is undeniable. Critics argue that Walz's focus on expanding social programs without implementing robust controls created a fertile ground for this kind of fraud. His reluctance to order a top-to-bottom investigation until federal authorities were already knocking on the door suggests a troubling lack of urgency. Attorney General Keith Ellison, the state's top law enforcement officer, has been conspicuously quiet on the matter. While the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota led the federal charge, Ellison's office, which has the power to investigate state-level fraud, did not take a leading role. This inaction has led many to question whether his office was asleep at the wheel or, worse, deliberately avoiding a case that could politically embarrass fellow Democrats. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. The city of Minneapolis was a major locus for the fraudulent sites. Mayor Frey's administration, which controls city-level licensing and zoning, did little to scrutinize the dozens of meal sites popping up in storefronts and community centers. The city's failure to conduct even basic due diligence allowed the criminal network to embed itself within the community, using the city's infrastructure as a shield for their illegal activities. However, the Feeding the Future program was just the tip of the iceberg. The child nutrition fraud is not an isolated incident but a symptom of a much larger problem: Minnesota's culture of lax oversight and blind faith in social service programs. The state has long been a laboratory for expansive social programs, often funded with federal dollars. However, this ambition has not been matched with a commitment to accountability. Other programs are now under scrutiny. Reports suggest similar vulnerabilities exist in the state's childcare assistance programs, housing subsidies, and COVID-19 relief grant distribution. The common thread is a system built on trust, with insufficient verification, where a lack of control is seen as a feature, not a bug. This creates an environment ripe for exploitation by sophisticated criminal networks that know exactly how to game the system. Into this problem comes the Trump administration's attempts to intervene in this pile of fraud. Recognizing the scale of the problem and the state's failure to police itself, the Trump administration has taken decisive action. The Department of Justice, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, has made prosecuting the Minnesota fraud a top priority. The FBI and federal prosecutors have already secured dozens of convictions, sending a clear message that this kind of theft will not be tolerated. Furthermore, the administration is leveraging the case to push for broader reform. Federal agencies are now threatening to withhold funding from states that cannot demonstrate adequate oversight mechanisms. This is a direct shot at Minnesota and other states with similar vulnerabilities. The administration's stance is simple: taxpayer money is a sacred trust, and if states are unwilling to protect it, the federal government will step in. With the news reports becoming almost an hourly event, the Democratic politicians in Minnesota decide to set up a smokescreen, another event to distract from the fraud reports. As the walls close in and the political fallout grows, Minnesota Democrats have launched a desperate and cynical campaign to divert public attention. Their chosen weapon: protests against ICE arrests of illegal immigrants with criminal records. In recent weeks, ICE has conducted targeted enforcement actions in Minnesota, apprehending undocumented individuals convicted of serious crimes such as assault, DUI, and drug trafficking. These are standard law enforcement operations designed to protect public safety. However, Democratic leaders, including Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, have been quick to condemn them, framing the arrests as an inhumane attack on immigrant communities. This narrative is a calculated distraction. By stoking outrage and organizing protests, they are attempting to shift the media cycle and public focus away from the fraud scandal. Every news story about an ICE protest is a story that isn't being written about the MD's negligence or the Attorney General's silence. They are essentially using the plight of immigrants as a political shield, hoping to rally their base and create a firestorm of emotion to obscure the cold, hard facts of their own incompetence and potential complicity. The strategy is as transparent as it is cynical. They are trying to change the subject from a story of Democratic failure to a narrative of Republican cruelty. But the facts are stubborn. Hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen on their watch, and no amount of protest theater can erase that reality. The people of Minnesota are beginning to see through the smokescreen, and they are demanding accountability for the real crime, the betrayal of their trust and the theft of their money. The fallout from Minnesota's fraud crisis has escalated dramatically, transforming from a state-level scandal into a national spectacle of federal intervention, political warfare, and a desperate campaign of distraction. As the full scope of the theft becomes clearer, so too does the depth of the failure by the state's Democratic leadership to protect taxpayer funds, a failure they are now scrambling to conceal. The Trump administration, having identified Minnesota as a ground zero for systemic fraud, has moved beyond simple investigations and into a phase of aggressive financial and law enforcement pressure. Small Business Administration head Kelly Loeffler took the extraordinary step of suspending agency funding to Minnesota to investigate a staggering $430 million in suspected Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, fraud across the state. This was quickly followed by Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services Jim O'Neill announcing a freeze on $185 million in federal childcare funding specifically for Minnesota. The federal message was unequivocal: not another dollar will be sent until Minnesota can prove it is being spent legitimately. The pressure then became national. On December 31, 2025, the Department of Health and Human Services announced it was freezing childcare funding for all 50 states until each could demonstrate proper oversight, a move directly inspired by the Minnesota crisis. This action effectively weaponized Minnesota's failure to force every other state in the union to immediately clean up its own act. Simultaneously, the Department of Homeland Security, under Secretary Kristi Noem, deployed hundreds of agents to the Twin Cities for what was termed a massive investigation on childcare and other rampant fraud. This overwhelming federal presence signaled that the era of state-level negligence was over. The scandal's gravity has drawn the full attention of the U.S. Congress. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer has launched an expansive investigation, aggressively probing the widespread fraud and the failures of Governor Walz's administration. Comer's committee is not only requesting information from the Treasury and Justice Departments, including suspicious activity reports, SARS, to track illicit financial flows, but has also compelled testimony from the state's top officials. In a major development, Chairman Comer announced that both Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison would testify at a hearing on March 4, 2026. This puts them directly under oath to answer for their administration's inaction. The political toll on Walz has been immense. Facing intense scrutiny and damning testimony, including allegations that his administration retaliated against whistleblowers and willfully turned a blind eye to crime, Walz withdrew his bid for a third term as governor in early 2026. An investigator from the state's own fraud office even testified that concerns over being portrayed as racist made the Walz administration reluctant to pursue fraud allegations within the Somali American community. Furthermore, it was revealed that Walz had received nearly $10,000 in campaign contributions from supporters connected to Somali-operated daycare centers, raising serious questions about conflicts of interest. The initial Feeding Our Future scheme, which involved defrauding the federal child nutrition program of at least $250 million, is now understood to be merely the flagship operation in a fleet of fraudulent enterprises. Federal prosecutors have uncovered a web of interconnected scams targeting Minnesota's most vulnerable populations. Housing fraud. Another group allegedly defrauded Minnesota's housing stabilization program of more than $104 million by falsely claiming to help people at risk of homelessness. Autism therapy fraud. A third scheme involved stealing $14 million by billing for autism treatment services that were never provided to children. Medicaid fraud. Federal prosecutors have estimated that total fraud within Minnesota's Medicaid programs could be as much as $9 billion, a figure state officials, including Governor Walz, have disputed. By early 2026, the Minnesota Department of Human Services was forced to recruit over 150 temporary employees to perform a comprehensive check of all 5,800 providers in high-risk Medicaid-funded programs, a task requiring unannounced site visits and intensive screening reviews. This reactive scramble underscores the catastrophic failure of proactive oversight that defined the Walz administration. As federal investigators closed in and political heat intensified, a new catalyst emerged in late December 2025, a 42-minute video from a 23-year-old YouTube content creator named Nick Shirley. The video, which alleged widespread fraud at Somali-run child care centers with little verifiable evidence, went viral and provided the perfect pretext for the next phase of the Democratic strategy. While state investigators later reported that 9 of the centers in the video were operating as expected when inspected Carrot 8, the political damage was done. The video became the justification for a renewed and highly publicized crackdown by federal agencies. More importantly, it became the focal point for a coordinated campaign to shift the public narrative. Democratic leaders, including Governor Walz, began to fiercely denounce the resulting federal immigration enforcement actions. Protests against ICE arrests of illegal immigrants with criminal records were amplified and framed as a racist assault on the immigrant community, a narrative eagerly pushed by local and national media. This is a deliberate and cynical maneuver. By stoking a culture war over immigration, Minnesota Democrats are attempting to achieve several goals: divert media attention from the financial fraud they enabled, rally their political base against a common enemy, and paint the federal investigators as bigoted aggressors. Every news cycle focused on an ICE protest is a cycle not spent dissecting the $9 billion in potential Medicaid fraud or the administration's failure to act on countless whistleblower reports. They are using the legitimate fears of a community as a shield to protect themselves from accountability for a historic betrayal of the public trust. The people of Minnesota are caught in the middle. While federal agents work to recover stolen funds and prosecute criminals, their own leaders are working overtime to ensure the public looks the other way. But the sheer scale of the hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars, makes it a crisis that cannot be shouted down with protests. The facts are plain, and the accountability that was avoided for so long is now coming, one way or another. The Minnesota fraud saga has moved from a shocking discovery to a full-blown constitutional crisis, pitting federal authority against a state apparatus that appears not just incompetent, but complicit. As layers of the scandal are peeled back, the picture that emerges is one of a Democratic establishment that presided over a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise and is now using every tool at its disposal to prevent the truth from reaching the public. The most damning evidence against the Walz administration is not just the scale of the fraud, but the active suppression of those who tried to stop it. A culture of fear permeated the very agencies tasked with oversight. One whistleblower from the state's own fraud office testified under oath that the administration's reluctance to investigate was fueled by a paralyzing fear of being accused of racism, particularly when scrutinizing programs heavily utilized by the Somali American community. This political correctness was not a benign oversight, it was a deliberate policy of inaction that allowed criminals to operate with impunity. This fear was weaponized. Employees who raised alarms were reportedly sidelined, reassigned, or pressured to drop their inquiries. The message was clear: protecting the administration's political image was more important than protecting taxpayer money. This internal rot explains why fraud was allowed to balloon from a few million into a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe. The system's internal watchdogs were muzzled, leaving the field wide open for the predators. The consequences of this negligence are now crashing down on Minnesota's economy and its most vulnerable residents. The federal funding freezes have thrown the state's social service sector into chaos. Childcare centers that rely on federal subsidies are facing imminent closure, leaving working parents in the lurch. Organizations that provide legitimate services to the poor and needy are seeing their funding dry up because the state's credit is now worthless in the eyes of federal auditors. The long-term financial damage is even more severe. Minnesota's reputation as a well-managed state is in tatters. The federal government is now demanding that the state pay back hundreds of millions in misspent funds, a bill that will ultimately fall to Minnesota taxpayers. This comes at a time when the state budget is already strained, setting the stage for either massive tax hikes or draconian cuts to essential services like education and transportation. The bill for the Democrats' negligence is coming due, and every Minnesotan will have to pay a share. A critical component of the Democratic defense strategy has been the active cooperation of sympathetic local and national media. Instead of focusing on the billions stolen, media outlets have amplified the narrative of victimhood surrounding the ICE raids, often framing the federal response as a heavy-handed and discriminatory attack on immigrant communities. The viral YouTube video alleging fraud in Somali-run daycares was treated by some as a bigger story than the confirmed $250 million Feeding Our Future scheme it was meant to distract from. This selective outrage serves a clear political purpose. By centering the story on race and immigration, the media helps the Democratic leadership change the subject from financial corruption to cultural warfare. It allows them to posture as defenders of the marginalized while simultaneously deflecting blame for their own catastrophic failure to govern. This is not journalism, it is crisis management disguised as news reporting. So, what is the road ahead? Will it be a state reckoning or a cover-up? Minnesota stands at a crossroads. The path forward will be determined by whether the forces of accountability can overcome the entrenched machinery of the political establishment. The upcoming testimony of Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison before Congress will be a pivotal moment. 9. Under oath and away from the protective bubble of the state capitol, they will be forced to answer direct questions about what they knew and when they knew it. Any attempt to obfuscate or lie to a federal committee will carry its own legal peril. The federal investigations are far from over. With DHS, HHS, the SBA, and the Treasury all active, the net is tightening. More indictments are expected, and they are likely to move up the chain of command, targeting not just the low-level fraudsters but the enablers and facilitators within the state bureaucracy who looked the other way. The Trump administration has made it clear that this is a top priority, and it will not relent until every dollar is recovered and every person responsible is held accountable. The people of Minnesota are waking up to the reality that they have been betrayed not by criminals, but by the leaders they elected. The protests and the political theater cannot hide the fact that their money was stolen, their programs were corrupted, and their trust was violated. The only question now is whether the state's institutions are strong enough to cleanse themselves or if the federal government will have to complete the disinfection process for them. The era of impunity is over in Minnesota. The reckoning has begun. The key question that remains is, will the public wake up? Will independents and Republicans finally step forward and demand a new direction? Obviously, the Democrats are attempting to continue the cover-up with the announcement that Amy Klobuchar will run for governor. The state and national Democrats came up with this scheme in hopes that she could be elected and continue the Democratic dominance of state government in Minnesota. Will the public buy the fact that it was just Walz, Ellison, and Fry who were to blame? We hope not. Minnesota has a corrupt system that has existed for decades and has finally been exposed. Only time will tell which direction the state will take. Thanks for watching.
Are you looking for a limitless supply of insightful reads to expand your mind and transform your life? Look no further than Nehemiah Reset's ebook library, where knowledge meets inspiration at nehemiahreset.org ebook. Go there today to discover a wealth of valuable resources to help you on your personal and professional journey to build a biblical worldview. Learn more about the Bible and how culture is impacting your worldview. Again, the ebook library is located at nehemiahreset.org ebook. Hope to see you soon. My name is Andrew. I am one of the spokespersons for Nehemiah Reset. The prior video was sponsored by Nehemiah Reset, a 501c3. Our mission is to assist Christians in developing a biblical worldview as it pertains to relevant cultural and biblical issues. We seek to inform Christ's followers, equip them, and mobilize them in action to vote for their biblical values and actively engage in our We are also committed to help Christians and non-believers to develop a better biblical view. Nehemiah Reset produces videos and ebooks to assist members of the church in developing a biblical worldview when it comes to cultural issues. We produce videos on key topics like public school indoctrination, the woke agenda, sex education, equity and inclusion, climate change, immigration, religious freedom, and much, much more. To learn more about Nehemiah Reset or to watch our latest videos, go to our website at nehemiahreset.org or our rumble.com channel. We produce 2 to 3 videos every week. To get a weekly list of our latest videos, sign up for our weekly newsletter by going to nehemiahreset.org/email and subscribe. You can support our website by liking our videos, subscribing to our channels, or helping us reach more people through tax-exempt donations. Thanks for your help in growing God's kingdom and bringing more people to Christ. Thank you for your support and help. Come back again soon. Have a great day.